I am very thankful and grateful to be here with you today to facilitate today's webinar titled Taking a Systemic Approach to Family Engagement. We have a full 2 hours together, and without further ado, I want to go ahead and get started. Excited to be here just to give you all a background about um, who I am and what kind of experience I bring to the table as a part of today's webinar. Currently, I am a lead trainer at University of Illinois in Chicago. I work with educators in strengthening and building their capacity around family engagement and also helping them to develop that critical network of support, really being mindful that we know this work is not easy. And so thinking about how we create that critical work-life balance. Formerly, I worked with the Illinois State Board of Education as a principal consultant, where I helped to co-author the Illinois State Board of Education's Family Engagement Framework and helped to develop tools, professional development opportunities, and resources for educators statewide. I'm a mom. I serve on my child's local school council, and I'm also a member of the National Association for Family and School Community Engagement. I know this work is important, and I know the impact that it has not only on the families that we work with directly, and the children, but most importantly, the centers, the sites, the schools, the districts, and communities that we are part of. So with that said, now that you all have a better sense of who I am, I really would love to know a little bit about who we have on today's webinar. And if you could complete the poll, identifying maybe what your background is in terms of your role, that would really be helpful to kind of know who we have today. Okay, it looks like we have a good balance of teachers and we have family service workers, in addition to having some folks who I work in special services, occupational therapists, speech therapists, etc. And then we have other. Um, for all folks who are on today's webinar, if you could just quickly type in your role so that everyone has a sense of who's on the webinar today. That'd be really helpful. And even if you want to give a shout out to, what area or part of Illinois that you're from, or what the name of your site is, that would be helpful as well. One of the things that I want to highlight on today's webinar is recognizing the fact that this is a critical learning opportunity for all, and that yes, I am leading today's conversation, and I frame it as that because I also want to recognize the skills, the experiences, a level of expertise of you, of the participants on today's webinar. You all come with a variety of backgrounds, and I want to be able to ensure that we can honor that and recognize that, and come forward with this idea that we are a community of learners together. So I encourage you all to share in the group chat when you feel like you want to share some information, a question. We'll be sure to acknowledge that and highlight that throughout the webinar, because ideally after today's webinar, we have an opportunity not to grow and learn from what we've heard today, but we have an opportunity to share with our colleagues, but then also network with each other to kind of expand our support for the work that we do on a day-to-day basis. And with that said, I also wanted just to also just recap and I should say, talk about how we are going ideally be a part of today's webinar. I would like to create a safe and brave space, if you will. So, going back to what I had said before, that we can create a space in which we're not afraid to share, that we recognize the ideas and questions that we bring forward during today's webinar, and that this truly is an opportunity to learn and to grow. And so with that said, I wanted just to kind of recap a couple of norms that we can agree upon, which means that we will engage in active listening, we'll listen for understanding, we'll speak from our own experience using I statements. We'll try and minimize distractions. I know this is a webinar, and that we may have a lot of things going on. But we'll try to be engaged as much as we can. And then also, that self-talk is real. So anything and everything that we say, there's no right or wrong answer. So encourage us to think about no put downs of yourself and of course of others. So if everyone could, and if everyone has any additional norms that they want to share as we move forward, please type those into the chat box. And if we all think that these norms make sense to us, and I'll just recap those, that we engage in active listening, that we speak from our own experiences, and we use I statements, that we minimize distractions, and we agree on no put downs of ourselves or others. If you could just raise your hand in the webinar so I know that these norms make sense to all of us, and we agree to participate moving forward in this way. Great. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And I also really appreciate just kind of seeing, the multiple hats that, or the variety of hats, I should say, that everyone wears on this webinar today. We have folks like Michelle Magnus, who is coming from a district, Luisa Corso, who's a pre-K teacher, quite a number of teachers I saw. Then we have a parent educator, Beatrice Marie, I apologize if I said your name incorrectly. Sharonda Brown, who's a program support specialist. So just thank you all for sharing, and thank you for agreeing to our group norms. So let's move ahead and get into the meat of why we're all here together. So there's 4 key takeaways that I hope that we'll be able to achieve, and that is, by the end of this webinar, we will be able to summarize the definition for family engagement. So I have some common language and understanding for family engagement. We'll examine our role as a family liaison, and that doesn't necessarily mean we have the direct title as family liaison, but we embrace that role in whatever capacity or role that we currently have, whether we're a teacher or an occupation therapist, or that we are that family support specialist. But we do recognize that we do carry that hat of being a family liaison, and we understand how integral it is a part of improving outcomes for children. We're going to be able to identify or choose evidence-based strategies and practices for engaging families. And we're also going to be able to design an action plan that will strengthen our role as a family service worker, or just more specific or more general, I should say, as a family liaison. So these are the 4 key takeaways that I have for you in today's webinar, but there may be some takeaways that folks may have, or a burning question they may have. And if you would like to go ahead and feel free to put that in the chat box, go ahead, and we'll make sure that throughout the webinar that we'll be able to touch upon that question or that takeaway that you would like to have as you walk away from that time that we have together, so that we can ensure that this webinar is as helpful for you as possible. And I'll give folks just a couple seconds to type their responses into the chat box. So as you're typing, we have another poll that I would like for us to engage in, and that is really, would you think about your upbringing, and who was that critical adult? Who was that caring adult that played a critical role in your life when you were growing up? Who was that adult? Was that a family member, a neighbor? Was it a friend, a teacher? Was it someone who worked in a space that served in the role as a family service worker or social worker? Or maybe there was another type of individual who played a critical role in your life as you were growing up as a young person. If you could identify in the second poll who that particular caring adult was in your life growing up, that would be really helpful. Okay, so it looks like a lot of us identified, a family member. Peggy says it was her mom. Lana says it was her sister. Maya Cruz and Jennifer gave another shout out to their mothers. Michelle identified her aunt. Jill third and seconded the mom shout out. Jamie acknowledged her grandparents. Um, Beatrice, recognized her teachers from kindergarten, first grade, and second grade. Lindsay and Louisa had a shout out to their parents. And in the poll, it looks like 85% of those who took the poll identified their family member um, as that critical person or that caring adult in their life growing up. And which is, obviously kind of not a surprise when we think about the powerful impact that families have on, especially on our lives when we were growing up. I mean, we can really sit back and reflect on the power they had on our lives as young people. And that's a lot to be said, especially as we think about our role in engaging families and how critical our work is in doing that. And as you think about your own personal life, realizing the impact that they played on it, and now stepping into that space in your profession, recognizing that your work with families inevitably impacts those outcomes and those experiences for children. Um, Not only for children, but ultimately, and I'll share this more as we move forward, but it also has an impact on the centers we work in, the sites, the schools, the districts, and ultimately the communities, um, excuse me, excuse me, that we serve. Um, so I wanted to just really highlight that because sometimes, we know this work is not easy, but we also can recognize that critical role that family plays in our own personal lives. And I also want to go back to something that was shared by Lindsay Oros. I believe one of her key takeaways was that she wanted to learn more about strategies about how to engage families outside of um, the learning centers. So we will definitely make sure we hit on that. And so thank you for sharing that. Um, because when we think about our impact and why family engagement is important, let's really kind of look at that first critical impact. And research continues to show that regardless of the socioeconomic background of that family member, um, students involved, with involved families, and we'll talk about what involved means. Does involved mean participating in that school activity or that being a part of that early education parent advisory meeting? What does that mean? What does that look like? But when there is value, when there's a level of involvement of families in a young person's life and beyond, outcomes for kids are unequivocally, undeniably, there. So students with involved parents are more likely to earn higher grades on their test scores. They enroll in higher level programs. They attend school regularly, so it has an impact on attendance. They show improved behavior. They develop better social skills, and they make better transitions, especially when you think about very young children moving from spaces, as infants into toddlers into pre-K spaces, kindergarten and beyond. Those transitions are a little bit more seamless. So the impact on the child is very tangible. Family engagement also has an impact on early learning spaces and beyond. I mean, there's research there that looks at that from a young child's life beyond into their school age life. And that research was really framed and coined. One of the leading research components was framed and coined by the University of Chicago Consortium on School Research. They had published about 20 years ago a report that looked at the 5 essentials. What are those key essential components that makes learning spaces strong? One of the things that they had discovered in their research was that families play a key role. And I'm going to put my mouse onto 2 areas in this into this picture, if you can see it. But in early ed spaces, there's also realization and specificity around how family engagement plays that critical role. It's in two spaces. It's around the parent voice. So how often and how responsive early learning centers are around parent voice, And then also this, once again, getting back to this idea of involved families, how involved families are in early ed learning spaces. Um, One of, how many of you by show of hands are familiar with the early ed essentials, which is a key data point for early ed spaces when we think about, how we're measuring our work around family engagement. Okay. Let me ask the other question. How many of you are familiar with um, the five essentials survey? Okay. Oh, okay. A little bit more hands. Okay, okay, great, great, great. So the Early Ed Essentials survey is survey that was designed based upon the five essentials, but really specifically catered for early learning spaces. And so one of the things that it noted was the five essentials survey was ultimately designed for traditional school based spaces. So it's really designed for families who have children enrolled in kindergarten and beyond, K through 12. But the OUNS partnered with the University of Chicago Consortium on School Research to publish the Early Ed Essentials, which allows us to then be able to capture that data into those birth to pre-K spaces. So there is a survey that is accessible and available with data that early ed spaces can certainly utilize to be able to capture what gains and impact they're having around quality improvements in their early ed spaces, and then also being able to look at some key data points as it pertains to really identifying how they're engaging families. Really thinking about how they're utilizing and working around supporting that parent voice, and then also really thinking about how they're engaging families as partners in that child's learning. So wanted to quickly highlight that because it really does touch upon this point. Ultimately, once again, when we look at early ed spaces that are strong in these, and in this case, for the early ed perspective, in these six essentials, are 10 times more likely to improve in student learning. So, family engagement once again plays a critical role on our centers. So we can see how it has impact on students and children, but now we can see how it has an impact on building quality centers. And the last piece is that family engagement has an impact on educators and families. So there's also this very personal impact that it has. So National PTA has done, culled together some key research points to recognize that when schools that work well with families, they have better teacher morale and higher ratings of teachers by parents. So we're really also looking at, when we think about engagement, we're thinking about that relationship, that relationship helps to frame or that perception ultimately does help to frame how the relationship moves forward. So that's also important, and because that also impacts how family members are going to respond to surveys such as the early ed essentials or the ed essentials, or even some of those surveys that are put together utilized at your respective spaces. Children from diverse and cultural backgrounds tend to do better when parents and educators work to collaborate to build that gap between the culture at home and their learning center. So family engagement really does allow for children and families to feel, for lack of a better word, more at home, or their centers have a better ability to be able to engage them in spaces that they'll feel comfortable. And that also helps to build confidence, especially moving forward to extend learning at home. Parents are more likely able to put in practice the engagement strategies they already know that are effective, but have been hesitant to contribute. So, if there is a trusting relationship ultimately that exists between the educator and the family, once again, it really does help them to think about and trusting how they can carry forward some of the things that they may have learned or observed during their visit, or and some information in a backpack, and think about ways they can extend that learning strategy at home and beyond, or even share it with their peers. So, when we think about the impact of family engagement on educators and families, it's really about how, it really has an impact on helping to build confidence and capacity to support children, but then also being able to create a network of support and moving forward around how we address and strengthen how children are learning, or they're growing and developing in learning spaces. So, what exactly um, is family engagement? Um, there's some words on the slide here, but I do want us to kind of level set a little bit. And if you could, in your chat box, type in how you would define family engagement. Just if you want to contribute a couple of words, or you have a full sentence you want to share, I would love for us to really kind of bring to the table all the ways in which we define family engagement, because that's important. And mind you, there's once again no right or wrong answers, but it really is powerful to be able to look at how we understand what family engagement is, and how we can build a common understanding ultimately of how family engagement is defined. So Jamie put it's about creating community. Lindsay said it's working, contributing, and asking questions. Sharonda noted that it's two-way communication. Michelle says it's parents and school community and family all working together to best help students and the school. Maricruz, she says it's both teachers and parents working together. Um, Javier, he says it's creating sustaining relationships with the entire family. So he's recognizing kind of the family dynamic, and it's not, and it goes above and beyond mom and dad, or just dad and mom, however that dynamic exists. Um, Stacia says it's home and school and community. Rachel states it's family engagement is when parent and teachers are communicating and learning from each other to help children. That's powerful. Tanya shot, nods to the working together. Megan says it's creating a community between home and school, and there's open communication as well as support. Lana says it's working as a team. Louisa says it's participation in your child's learning. Absolutely. Pegasus is collaboration. Oh, Megan says it's respectful. Great word. And mutual. Erica says there's collaboration and connection. Kristen says it's families working together with professionals and choosing goals, targets, and working as a team, right? So there's this level of intentionality built into that. Jill says it's working collaboratively between home and school. And Jolanta says families feel welcomed, and there's a welcoming environment there for them. My goodness, you guys are amazing. I love what you've shared, and then you've really gotten to the heart of the definition for family engagement. It sounds like we're really kind of dead center in how we think about our work, which is an exciting space to be a part of. Um, so, as you all have stated, family engagement is a shared responsibility. It's not necessarily on the onus of the parent alone, or that teacher alone, or that family service worker alone to build and cultivate that relationship. So ultimately, that child has the supports he or she may need to be successful. It's meaningful engagement is really based on the premise that parents, educators, and community members ultimately share responsibility for the academic, physical, social, emotional, and behavior development of that student. And I think Erica may have alluded to this, but it's there's some intentionality behind the work. It's a deliberate process. What we do is not for the work for the sake itself. There are some built-in goals that we have in mind as we move forward in this partnership, in this relationship, and recognizing that family engagement is really fostered through a deliberate process, and that it's embraced throughout our learning spaces. So it's not just on the onus of the teacher, or that family support specialist, or that home visitor, or the site director, or the school counselor, or the speech therapist, to ensure that families feel supported and that teachers have the capacity to engage families in meaningful ways. It's really a hat that we all wear. And ultimately, it empowers adults. And once again, that word is very general for a reason. It empowers adults. So we're recognizing that it empowers, that adult in that child's life, whether it is all those roles I just stated, teacher, occupational therapist, so on and so forth. But it empowers all. Um, so there's all to jointly support student growth, address any barriers to learning, and ensures college and career readiness. So Empower also does acknowledge that there's some level of um, learning and capacity building that we need in our work in building that relationship. We don't necessarily come to the table with all the answers. And so we may need a professional learning opportunity. We may need a training or a workshop. We may need to further deepen our capacity and our abilities and our skill sets to be able to move forward in building these relationships, because we may not have that training in our pre-service work and the role that we're currently in, or as a parent, we may not necessarily know how to best navigate that space. So there is an opportunity for us to grow and learn together, and so we need to be able to have ways to be able to grow and strengthen our understanding around how we build that relationship. Um, so we're not necessarily pointing the fingers, and we acknowledge the additional support we need. Foremost, effective family engagement systems, policies, and practices are mindful of diverse school communities that are rich in language, culture, and school experiences. So we find ways to honor differences. And family engagement is responsive to student and family needs. So there's this level of flexibility and resiliency built into this work. Want to really highlight that family engagement ultimately is not just a set of activities that we do to parents, that it's about that partnership, it's about building that relationship, and it's ultimately about how we build confidence, capacity, and have the supports to create partnerships that are intentionally centered around outcomes for students. Um, and I know sometimes that can be really hard, especially when you think about how we are many things, and we're going to get into that. But when we think about one, I talk about the bean counting phenomena. When we know that our work ultimately around family engagement sometimes can only be measured around how many families came to an event or how many families we served, that number alone cannot and should not justify um, and measure our impact on our work around family engagement. We also can look at other data points, which include survey perception data, which is a part of the early ed essentials, the 5 essentials work, or even looking at how more confident and capable a parent or educator may feel around being able to support their child in learning or being able to engage each other in navigating that relationship. So there's multiple ways in which we can measure that work. So let's just call the elephant out in the room, and let's just recognize that we know family engagement is not easy. um, in the chat box, can we talk about that? Where does it get hard? Where does our work get hard? What are those questions and challenges that we come up with? Um, and let's have a let's call that out as we move forward. Yes, Megan says time, absolutely. Lindsay says getting families to respond so for families to be responsive. Judith notes that families not attending. Yep. So families and they only come to our spaces for childcare only. They have this real tunnel opinion or vision for how they want to engage that space. Um, Rachel states that parents shut down. Parents feel they're at their best. Parents think we're going to judge them. Families are absent. So there's this feeling of that families feel like they're going to be judged coming to our space. Language barriers, having access to translators may be limited. Um, Work schedules, having different shifts of working schedules, and Parents can't necessarily attend events that we may have so carefully and thoughtfully planned. As parent coordinators, she said she's struggling with training her teachers on how to best build that relationship with families so that they can feel comfortable with teachers and the classroom. Um, yeah, so willingness for families to engage in therapy. There could be a lot of barriers around that. Schedules, yes, that's a big one. Short time to spend in the program, so time is a big issue. Um, no, there's not an interest to work together. Um, Families are really working to kind of meet that bottom line in terms of shelter, food, clothing, housing, and just may not have an interest. Um, Language barriers, busy, transportation, especially when we think about transportation in the rural area. Thank you, Diana, for calling that out. Transient families, migrant families, families who may move from place to place pretty frequently, recognizing how families can be absent in many ways, and get the changing phone numbers. So how what's going to be the best ways to reach out to them, communicate to them when it's difficult to get them on the phone. Motivating teachers to build partnerships with families, and then ultimately planning events that appeal to a wide range of families working around work schedules. So, time, transportation. I mean, there's a lot of barriers that you guys have put on the table when we think about family engagement and what those barriers are. On this PowerPoint, I really kind of lumped in three major types of barriers. And as we think about those pragmatic barriers in terms of time and transportation, I think that's part of potentially some of these larger buckets that are on the PowerPoint. One bucket I identify as kind of what those organizational barriers are. So, we may have a tremendous, if we're in a Head Start funded space or PA funded space, there's a case management component to our work. So we may have an incredible amount of families that we serve on our caseload. So being able to create that welcoming relationship, knowing that we have so many families that we have to serve. I mean, doing that work in a meaningful way may make it hard. Um, that when we think about kind of what those barriers are in an organization in terms of how the organization values family engagement, is that a part of their mission and vision? Is family engagement an embedded part of a continuous improvement plan or their strategic plan? Are there dedicated staff to support families in meaningful ways, and what role do they have, and is their role honored? Are they going to have to wear multiple hats, maybe because they're being called to serve in the classroom, or they're being called to do this and that? Maybe no one clearly understands or knows like what exactly that role of the position is for a family worker. Um, and then there could be just also thinking about having the funds. We talk about transportation needs in rural areas. That can be an organizational barrier where we don't necessarily just have the resources to be able to, bring families back and forth to various activities or find ways to be able to bring them to our spaces so that they can be face to face in those spaces with us. I also talk about personal barriers. So there may be barriers that we may have that we may not even be aware of in terms of our work with families. I know that when I was doing the work myself, I really had to be cognizant of and aware of my own implicit bias in moving forward with the work. What were the thoughts that I had um, with the families that I served that could potentially really prevent me from being able to open up and step into a space where I felt a little vulnerable, so that I could create that trusting relationship with that family. So I have a definition from the Perception Institute about what does implicit bias mean, how we define that. So implicit bias is like when we have a bias, and rather than being neutral, we have a preference for or an aversion to a person or group of people. Thus, we use the term implicit bias to describe when we have attitudes towards people or associate stereotypes with about them without even being conscious about that idea, that perception that we hold. So having that level of self-awareness about any implicit bias that we may have can be helpful in terms of how we move forward in navigating our partnerships with families and how we work to build that trusting relationship, and also thinking about this idea of cultural competency. But some of that stuff, can when we think about just having access to translators can be hard exact as well. Um, Melanie also brought up something about implicit bias. She says, implicit bias we hold, do we really believe parents are their child's first teacher? That's a great question to ask. That's a really great question to ask, Melanie. Because ultimately, when we think about our strengths-based approach and working with families, that's a really great question to ask. Another one is thinking is how we define cultural competency. And I'm pulling this definition from the National Education Association. But this definition is defined as cultural competence is having an awareness of one's own cultural identity and views about difference and the ability to learn and build on the varying cultural and community norms of students and their families. It is ultimately the ability to understand within the group differences that make each student unique while celebrating the between group variations that ultimately make our country's tapestry. So really thinking about not only some of those maybe implicit biases that we have, but also really being aware and attuned to recognizing what is our own cultural identity, and how does that cultural identity help to craft and shape our views, and does it allow us to really be flexible enough so that we can think about how we honor those other cultural norms that may exist within our spaces and our centers, and how that can unlock or lock the doors in which we're working with families. Um, the other barrier is also recognized as kind of those familiar barriers. So those barriers that may exist, and this came from the work of Catherine Hoover Dempsey, but she's really boils it down to three buckets. Recognizing that when that parent engagement is not a single event, but it's ultimately a process that evolves over time. And three factors that can be barriers for families specifically is whether or not families believe that they should play a role in their child's education. Where is your sense of self-efficacy around helping their child learn? So it goes back to our, recognizing, do they feel like they have that ability, that confidence, to be able to support their child in learning, and that can be a big role, a big barrier to being able to support them. Another barrier could be, that invitation, that what is how welcome do they feel? How comfortable do they feel? Do they feel like this is a trusting space? Um, that can be another key barrier to a family wanting to come to an event, or wanting to come into a learning space. And then the last one is really thinking about the parents' life context. So any socioeconomic, cultural, um, social norms or backgrounds, experiences that they may have around engaging and learning space with their child. So if they have any previous bad experiences in being at school, that could impede the desire to even want to come into early ed space. Someone noted about their perception of that daycare facility. So they have kind of the social belief that this is the daycare and it's not a space to for our child to learn and grow. So that can become a barrier, and there could be a cultural barrier whereby the parents may not feel it is their role to question or to be at this on the same level as the teacher, because of maybe how much they value that role of that teacher, and maybe ultimately they don't necessarily embrace their role as someone Melanie had I believe Melanie or yeah Melanie had stated as being their child's first teacher. Um, so there's a quite a number of barriers that really are on the table, in addition to the ones that I think that you've identified. The transportation, the time, the work schedules, but there are really, I think, a lot of opportunities, for us to be able to think about. where are those opportunities and how do we navigate those opportunities to engage families in meaningful ways. Um, when I think about, how we build that trust, that ultimately this work really does start in building that trusting relationship. And so I want to do a quick exercise with you. Um, I've kind of done this in a different space. If you've been a part of this activity, I apologize, but I like this because it brings home to the idea about trust ultimately. Um, when we think about that trusting relationship, if you can, close your eyes and think about that trusting relationship you currently have in your life. And that can be with anyone you think about. But when you think about that trusting relationship, how does it make you feel? Um, what are those things about that relationship that's trusting? Okay, I want you to think about that. And in the chat box, what's a word or two that comes to your mind when you think about the most trusting relationship in your life? Okay, Cecilia said safe. Megan said safe. Lindsay said happy. There's communication. There's a level of, um, Michelle said, always there for me. Honesty and security, secure, supportive, always there. Long term, non judgmental, content, balanced, safe and happy, individualized, confidant, I should say. Safety, comfort, feeling heard, consistent, non judgmental. Mighty Cruz said respectful. Yes, a couple more people are typing. Um, okay, so we could start there. When we think about in the beginning where I had asked the question about, where does it get hard? Um, some, in some ways, our families may not necessarily feel comfortable. They may not feel welcomed. And a lot of that really does boil back to this word of trust. Um, and when we think about those trusting relationships we have in our lives, how could we strengthen our work around or help to strengthen our work around building those trusting relationships with the families that we serve? That's just a question to ponder. And we'll come back to that when we do our action plan activity. But really want us to think about that. And I'm also going to acknowledge, there are those really hardcore tangible barriers, right? When we talk about time and transportation, as well as, access to translators. Those are very, um, um, you know, tangible barriers, and we can talk about and share more about how we address those barriers. But thank you all for stepping into that space with me as we think about how we really think about those trusting relationships and think about how that translates into our work with families. Even when we think about hard to reach families, young families, fathers, non English speaking families, families with diverse learners, multi generational families, non traditional families. And by non traditional, I'm really kind of referring to, families that may be single family homes, or it could be parents where they may be divorced. It could be families that have um, a number of factors happening, maybe foster family, maybe a situation where the child is adopted. Um, there are many ways in which we can really understand and know our families. But there's some key practice strategies fundamentally that we can think about when we think about our work in working with families in general. So one of the things that I've noted. Some of this came from the parent, family, child engagement framework from Head Start. How many of you guys familiar with the PFCE framework? By show of hands. Okay. Some of these came from some of these practice strategies came from the PFCE framework, and you do have a copy of that framework as one of your handouts. But some of those kind of practice strategies is what they would suggest is know your families, Who are your families? What are the ways that we can, better understand who our families are? I know we get a lot of information from our intake forms. And we got a lot of information from the assessment. We get a lot of information when we do the orientations, etc. But what are some ways in which we can organize that data, or be able to take a time to look at that data and be able to find ways to know our families? Home visitors, I think, have a very unique way to be able um, to know their families. But that's something to think about. How well do we know our families? Someone also said individualized. How we can think about individualizing supports for our families. I know it's not the easiest way, but it can be in the long run be a really efficient and effective way to be able to engage, especially what we identify as our hard to reach families. How can we honor the differences of our families, bring that to light? How do we provide supports to families, especially when we think about those supports for our young families, and how are we aware of those personal and familiar barriers that exist for families to be able to engage? We talked about transportation, translators, etc. And then how can we be flexible? And then how can we think about how we engage our community partners in terms of being able to extend or leverage um, what additional supports we need for our families. Ultimately, in all of the ways in which we engage our hard to reach families, one of the things that comes forward from the dual capacity framework that was published by the U.S. Department of Education for family engagement um, is that families ultimately really need to, in addition to really thinking about how we build their confidence and their capacity to support and build that relationship with educators that ultimately are linked to outcomes for their children, is to think about how we work to expand their social capital, ultimately how we work to expand their own networks of support. So when we think about these hard to reach families, how can we really think about maybe like a dad support group? Or how many of you are familiar by parent cafes by show of hands? Anybody familiar with the parent cafe process? Okay, so parent cafes can be a really great way to think about how we build parent to parent networks and supports for families. These are family led conversations around key topics and themes, but ultimately, at the end of the day, families realize that they're not alone. And that, once again, can be a great opportunity to expand upon the social capital for families in that way, building that network of support. I've also seen, crafting circles with grandparents, play groups for families of diverse learners, community home visits that are facilitated for non-English speaking families that occur maybe at a community center or at a church or in a neutral space in an apartment complex that maybe a majority of those families reside within. So there's just a number of ways that we can think about building a network of support for families. Um, and Beatrice states that um, so she does acknowledge the parent cafes. Diana says she hasn't been successful with parent cafes. So let's think about how we can support Diana if she wants to share more about how that work has been hard for her. We're all here to support. Judith says she calls these parent cafes parent chats, but it's usually the same few families that come. And those same few families can be really great powerhouses in terms of how we encourage them or activate them as those key connectors in some respect. Yes, we may have those same few families, but we do have a core families that we can ultimately leverage and utilize and being able to maybe build a network of support for other families. And Beatrice says she has the Parent Cackway that's a part of her parent advisory council as well as her bilingual parent advisory committees. And Jolanta seconds that. She says the BPACs are successful. Oh, she says that the BPACs. So that's another kind of way for families to come together to talk about how they can support learning outcomes for kids and then just really come together and build a network of support that way. PACs and BPACs are oftentimes funded through title funds, which is nice because that's a great way to leverage additional resources to support how that work unfolds specifically within schools that get Title I funding, as well as Title III funding. So thank you for sharing. All right, so now we talked about how we build a network of support for the families and how having that level of social capital is important for them to kind of really feel more connected and more confident about how they navigate early ed spaces. But what about you? where is your network of support? Who are the allies that we should be engaging? Um, families. I'm sorry. Let me read it as it said. Who are and or should be your allies engaging families in meaningful ways? So where are those additional allies? Where are those folks that you can tap into to build your own personal network of support around family engagement and beyond? Okay, so a lot of people are saying it's the classroom teachers. Some folks identifying the site center directors, home visitors, as well as the health and nutrition staff. Also, a shout out to the feeder elementary school staff. Ultimately, we know that if we're a school-based program, that we have additional allies within those spaces, and if we're a community-based program, we certainly can reach out to those school-based, those feeder elementary school staff to help make that critical connection between the early ed space and the school day space. So, yes. So I'm glad to see there's just kind of a variety of ways in which we're thinking about or we have allies of support in our work because we know that we cannot do this work alone. Thank you for your contributions to that poll question because it really does set us up for this next transition. And we think about our role and then how's family engagement a part um, of our role and beyond, as I had mentioned before when I was reading out loud the objectives. But ultimately, we do engage families in our own unique roles, whether we're straight out family service workers, or there's a level of engagement in our technical roles. So for family service workers, that's a part of the title, family. But there's a lot there. So family service workers, in the traditional sense, really work on recruitment and intake and case management. They help to coordinate those family engagement activities. There's a lot there. Teachers play a critical role as well around family engagement. So thinking about their role in terms of how they engage families around classroom instruction, learning assessments, lesson planning, um, the center director's role and how they, have opportunities to engage families in thinking about dedicating resources or embedding or integrating families into the mission, vision, and strategic plan for their work. Their ASEA coordinator, when they think about how they measure family engagement or talk about it and thinking about how they're meeting compliance requirements for the various centers and sites that they work within. Home visitors, what does their role look like in supporting families beyond the classroom and in the family's home? How can they work to build the confidence and capacity for families in that way? And then also health and nutrition staff workers. I'm thinking about their role around family engagement. Those feeder elementary school staff. If you're a school-based pre-K space, really thinking about the beyond opportunities, the beyond the pre-K opportunities, the kindergarten, first grade, second grade, third grade connections that can be made around family engagement and those other additional supports that you have, such as the principal, et cetera. And then counselors, really helping to unpack that family engagement. Yes, it's about how it supports those academic learning, but also the social emotional learning, the physical development, et cetera. That's a part of that child's growth and development. Um, Beatrice says, I think family engagement is a team. Absolutely. Everybody needs to work together for that perfect environment. And, sometimes we can be really caught up in the role that we play and which has, you know, its own merit. We all have deadlines and obligations and priorities that we have to fulfill. However, if we think about it in the way of when we engage families in meaningful ways, when we engage families in addressing barriers to learning, when we engage families in helping us around planning and improvement, like our work actually does get better and more, and it becomes more effective over the long term if we can do that well. So the investment that we put in around family engagement is high, understandably, in the beginning, absolutely. But over time, and as that work is sustained, it will definitely pay off twofold. Um, there was a story about a teacher. She was a golden apple teacher, if I'm saying that correctly. And she, was such a rock star in the classroom. And the principal decided that they wanted to implement the parents as teachers home visiting model into their school. And she was very much against it because she felt like she was such a rock star teacher that she did not need to be able to engage families in that way. And she reluctantly participated in the home visiting program. But one of the things that for her, she had a chance to visit the child's home that she worked in. She was able to better understand the context for that child and really be able to think about identifying even deeper and stronger supports for that child in the classroom. And she said when she was able to engage families in that way, in this way with the home visiting model, she was even more effective as a teacher. So I just thought that was an interesting vignette to share. One of the things to note in terms of when we think about our work, recognizing that family engagement is not just an activity, but it's also our practice, it's also our policy, it's also kind of the way in which we structure and dedicate resources for the work. We can move and think about family engagement in a different way. Okay, so you have a chart before you, and it's titled FSCE High Impact Strategies. And then there's an arrow that goes from lower impact to higher impact. On the lower impact side, we see bulletin boards, fundraisers, parents volunteering, class parties, PTAs, potlucks, student performances. Sorry, it's really small on my end. Generic newsletters. And then we have higher impact strategies, which talk about goal setting talks and weekly data sharing folders and home visits. Um, what is the difference? Like, how are the activities or the statements, I should say, on the lower impact different, or what's different from these low impact practices and activities to the more higher impact practices and activities? Anybody have any ideas about what makes these kind of, is there a common denominator between this transition from low to high? Okay, Shannon said yes. Personalization. Jennifer said personal contact. Lindsay said higher impact is more involved. Yes. Lana said low impact doesn't require family engagement. It's kind of very vague. Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Okay. Rachel says everyone effort one puts into it. Okay. Yeah. Stacy Cecilia says connection. And Louisa says, yeah, she agrees. This feel more personal. Yeah. Oh, and Michelle says low impact is less about specific families, children, and higher impact is tailored more to specific needs. Ooh, and she said that word strengths. And then Melody says planning for versus planning with. Yes. So you guys are on the ball. I mean, you really identified some key terms here. This level of personalization, this level of individuality, and I would like to kind of bring that into, exactly what Beatrice said, that personal relationship. How we're now moving into a more relational space when we go from a low impact to a high impact strategy. It's a lot more relational. And then we move more into that relational space. Yes, it does feel more individualized and personal. Um, and then there was a comment made higher before that talked about this idea of planning for versus planning with. So there's this level of trying to figure things out together when we talk about goal setting talks. So it's a conversation that we're having. It's not necessarily something we're saying, this is where your child is at, this is where your child needs to be, here's the information, now you go figure it out, right? It's about sitting down at the table and having that conversation. Um, so yeah, that's when we think about our work and how we can really think about ways to kind of a practice strategy. So which is where we're getting into right now. So some key practice strategies around meaningful family engagement that we can incorporate into our own practice. I noted this is a process condition. This is a term taken from the dual capacity framework. There are certain things that we can do within our own realms to really think about how we step into more effective spaces for engaging families. So how we think about our own how we think about the work, how we think about building that mutual trust. Um, excuse me. And trust. We've kind of already unpacked that word, but there's also another key term I talk about, and it's called relational trust. How we build relational trust. I'm going to type that into the chat box so we have it. Um, and so when we think about relational trust, it really goes back to a lot of those terms you guys have already defined, but there's a level of responsiveness there, there's a level of follow-up, there's a level of security and a level of confidence, I should say confidentiality that's built into that, and also transparency. Um, and then also we are intentional about what we're doing. So we're linking it to learning and development outcomes. Yes, there's much to be said for how we work to build that relational trust, but we really do have to build that relational trust with a vision in mind. So we're working to connect kind of a lot of the things that we share and do to, and this is how we can support this child in his or her area of growth for learning and development. It's another practice condition is this idea of being patient and persistent and coming from a strengths-based approach or using that family's assets. Um, one of the things that we wasn't said, but I know that it is hard about family engagement, especially is working, with a family in which maybe this is an adverse situation, and it becomes really intense. So how can we flip that? How can we really ensure that when we start building that relationship, that we start from an asset-based approach, that we start building on and identifying and recognizing the strengths of that parent from day one. Um, and that knowing that family engagement's never done. We can't check the box off and say done. It's an ongoing process. And we cycle in and cycle out families. And, it's just something that just continues to happen for us and that we grow from that. It's also about how we learn. Another practice strategy is learning about that family's culture. Also, once again, knowing more about our own culture and how we're able to be in that space and honor and recognize those differences, but yet celebrate the commonality of being in that space together. Thinking about how we engage families as decision makers in authentic ways. So if we invite families to be a part of a meeting, how prepared is that family? What does that invitation look like? Is it a face-to-face invitation that we make? Is it an email? Do we feel that family member feels confident and has the capacity to serve and on that pack or on that BPAC in a way in which they won't feel intimidated? And when they do share, how responsive are we to that information? Do we write down what they state on a whiteboard as they're stating it so that they can visibly see that we're acknowledging that? Do we incorporate some of, or how do we make visible the ways in which we're incorporating their feedback? I mean, that can be really important too. And then, know your families and be prepared. When we are ready to do our intake, or when we're ready to orientate a new family, or when we're having a courageous conversation, a hard conversation with a family, how can we be best prepared to walk into that conversation in a way that's going to be meaningful? So here are some 6 practice strategies that we can think about. Um, So when these are very general practice strategies that I just described, I didn't get into any specific details or share any specific stories about how those practice strategies can unfold at your specific learning spaces, sites, centers, schools, etc. Let's hear from you. Like, how do these practice strategies um, how are these implemented on the field? What can that look like? What has that looked like for you when you have been able to maybe build that trusting relationship, or you were able to find a way to build a level of cultural responsiveness and respect in your space, or there is a tool that you use to ensure that you're linking, things to learning and development as you're engaging families. Like, we're making that visible. Ways in which we are thinking about how we're being collaborative. What are those specific practices that we do? Um, how we're being using a strengths-based approach, etc. Jolanta says, she says, it always starts with the home visit. So home visits can be really successful ways in which we can really engage families on a one-on-one basis. Being able to visit that family's home, we're able to understand better that family context. You get to a really inside scoop of, the sacredness of how that family functions. What's the best way that that child may learn? What are some of those opportunities to really build on in terms of identifying supports for that family, etc. Ah, Louisa said that she calls parents to tell them positive things that she sees going on in the classroom. That's a really great practice strategy. So, oftentimes that call home is that negative call home, but Louisa says she takes the time to do that positive call home. Yes, that does take time to make that call, but she has prioritized that, and I bet you that just goes, that takes her many miles in terms of how she's able to really build kind of a trusting relationship with that parent. Erica says that she's increased background knowledge for use in lessons, making them more meaningful, especially when cultural differences are prevalent. So, Erica, I believe, has some level of teacher in her role, and she really works to incorporate that into her lesson plans in the classroom, and that's really powerful because students are able to really connect with that, and the parents can really connect with that as well. And I'm assuming, and then Jennifer says she starts building parent relationships during registration, screening, and the initial home visit. So she starts that from the beginning, from the very start. Um, Lindsay engages in constant contact. So she's contacting parents in a variety of ways, calling them or emailing them on the progress of their students. So she's doing progress checks with that family member, and she's using multiple ways of communication. So it may not just be that phone call. It may be an email. It may be a text. So there's different ways, or a home visit. Megan says for learning and development, they use an app to share pictures and videos. That's great. When my children were young, I love those kinds of apps. Right now, one of those apps that my child's classroom uses is the Shutterfly, and I know there's many more out there. And that's not a sponsored shout out, mind you, but that was just what I'm familiar with. Feel free to enter in all those kinds of apps that folks may use that are helpful to extend learning or share progress updates and videos as well. Um, Beatrice says that when my family needs specific help in very serious situation, she never minimizes the effort they put in to try to solve the situation, and she keeps the level of confidentiality around her work and integrity. Thank you, Beatrice, for sharing. Um, Sue says that they host a parent university night. So those are really great ways to be able to help families connect with each other, to learn more ways in which they can support their young children at home. Hopefully, Parent University Night comes with dinner and childcare, or maybe a parent-child way to learn together. But I think that's a really great strategy. Thank you, Sue, for sharing. Um, Diana says she's a family educator, and she learns the names of the children when she speaks with the parents, so that parents know, like, oh, she knows my child's name. She is really making an effort to better understand who my child is as she's engaging families, and that can go a long way. And so ultimately, parents know what's going on in the classroom. She provides them things they can do at home, so they feel more involved. So she really does find ways to extend learning at home beyond the classroom. Thank you, Jennifer, for the app. Um, and I love the questions you guys are asking each other. So we are going to, okay, welcome back. So we took a couple minutes to for break, but we had just um, talked about what are some of those practice strategies that we think about in our work and engaging families in meaningful ways. I just want to say thank you for sharing all of the really wonderful strategies and on the ground ways in which you are. Um, sharing your how your work unfolds on the ground. So I also wanted to just um, move on and think about ways in which we can think about our work um, and from a systemic level. So when we think about family engagement, we've talked about those practice strategies. But what are those strategies that we can also recognize and identify, acknowledging that we work as a part of organizations or schools or districts. There may be certain things that you had mentioned before as a barrier that sometimes can go um, out of our own hands. And so I also wanted to talk about what are those organizational conditions that are really important for us when we think about creating that family engagement system that ultimately leads us to thinking about ways in which we can engage families. So when we think about those organizational conditions, we think about how that that work needs to be systemic. So family engagement is something that's embraced throughout the organization that we work within. We think about how this work is integrated and embedded in all strategies. We talked about our roles, and we also acknowledged that family engagement touches upon that technical role that we wear, whether we are an occupational therapist, or if we're a teacher, or if we're um, the center director or the site director, or if we're that family service worker. Like, family engagement absolutely does touch upon our roles, and it is an integral part of everything that we do, and that ultimately this work is sustained. We know that funding comes and goes, but family engagement is just as important as it is for classroom instruction. So it really is a critical part of our role through and throughout. So these are just kind of three key ways in which we can think about how we ensure that we have a way to take a systemic approach for family engagement. And I like this particular visual because we can visibly see how families engagement is pretty much a key component to everything we do and every hat that our colleagues and our partners wear and for their work. And so it's really kind of a shift and a shift in values and a shift of priorities when we think about family engagement. So if we think about it as a standalone bucket, that's kind of how that and where that work will will remain. But if we think of family engagement as an integral part of everything that we do, it then doesn't become that kind of separate, one-off, or maybe forgotten area to fund or to ensure that we're doing this work within and with. That it's like, when we think about our curriculum, how does this curriculum have tools and resources for us to work with our families in addition to our children? Are the supports there for being able to extend learning beyond the classroom? Did we engage families in how we identified that curriculum, or how can we ensure families better understand the curriculum that we're using? Could we, think about how we talk about or integrate that curriculum and maybe into a parent university? Do we have kind of a parent cafe session about our curriculum? I mean, these are just some of the ways in which we can really think about how we engage families throughout everything that we do within our ed learning spaces. More tangibly, when we think about those systemic policies and practices, those systemic policies, that infrastructure and those process needed, here's just a more, once again, some general buckets that we can think about. And these buckets came from the Illinois State Board of Education Family Engagement Framework. and we were thinking about ways to support educators about thinking about how they move forward in this work. So once again, how have we um, developed a mission vision for our spaces in which family engagement is an integral part of that, and that is also shared with our family engagement with our families and other stakeholders. Um, that can be important, especially for an early ed spaces. Having the word of family can really be important to and acknowledging the critical role and that critical partner that families are in our spaces. How do we have thinking about families as a part of our continuous improvement planning efforts? Do we have family voice in those meetings? And if we do have family voice in those improvement planning meetings or whatever that looks like, how are we facilitating those conversations so that families feel welcomed and they feel like they can contribute to those conversations and that their contributions are being looped back and are responsive to those contributions. Um, and we also think about our processes. How are the spaces that we've created mindful of the diversity of families that we serve? And how do we have systems and processes in place to ensure that we do have some high level of responsiveness there? And are we investing in supports to ensure that there's dedicated time for workshops or trainings that staff may need around building their capacity to feel confident and capable and engaging families in meaningful ways? And that can look like a number of different things. It could be, a meeting on team building. It could be how do you facilitate meetings with families. There's a, even thinking about the case notes that we're required to keep. How could we use maybe something we call the SOAP-D method for case notes, which the S actually stands for strengths based. So how, or in some cases subjective, but how can we even think about, helping to support our practices around ensuring that we have that dedicated time to grow in how we know and the best ways to engage our families from a number of ways. Making sure that we have data at our fingertips and making sure that we're measuring the right kinds of things as we're trying to move the needle or trying to improve our family engagement efforts. So we talk about this idea of making data accessible. So how many of us can navigate the five essential data that we could see for our school or our district? Does anybody know how to access that data? By show of hands, I should say, or even the early ed essential data. So that's an opportunity to really think about how we're able to look at and access that data because there's perception data there, and that can tell us how families feel about being able to partner with their teachers and supported learning at home, and that's really a really critical data point. I'll tell you this that you can access the uh, five essential survey data by through the Illinois report card. And if you go to the Illinois report card and you type in the name of your school or your district, a school will be better. Type in the name of your school. District, you can get it that way too. And then there is a section there where it talks about the school, the learning environment. And if you click on that link, once your school profile pops up, you'll see a circle that kind of looks like the circle that I shared with you earlier about the Early Ed Essentials tool. But that will take you right into your particular school's data. And that might even be a whole other webinar that we can go into. But the Illinois Learning Report the report card can be your first way to access your family engagement data. And then also you have data within your case management systems you could access. In some ways, folks have kind of created their own spreadsheets to help them identify key data points or help to better understand the families that they serve. And you can even think about surveys. Karen is going to be raffling off the Beyond the Bake Sale book at the end of this presentation. And in the Beyond the Bake Sale book, there are surveys that you could certainly cut and paste and use for at your particular spaces. And then also thinking about, just the physicality of your space, how you work to create, how you work to create maybe family learning spaces within your sites or even in the classroom, um, or even thinking about how learning can be extended home. I know that some of you are home visitors, but I'm also even thinking about how we can extend learning beyond the home, like maybe in partnership with the local library, or and working with um, the like I mentioned before, there was a group of families who happened to live in the same apartment complex, so they worked with their the manager to host a mom and me kind of toddler event to help those families get together. So there's a lot of creative ways that we can think about the space, especially in those areas in which transportation is a challenge. Um, I also know that we can even think about how we leverage funds to be able to, um, secure opportunities for family engagement and leverage opportunities for family engagement beyond our early ed dollars. I know that if you work in a school or if you even work in a community-based center and you have, you can have a partnership with a school or can think about creating a partnership with a school. If that school is Title I eligible, they could apply for, if not be their current recipient of Title IV Part B funding, which is helps to provide after school programs, and those after school funds are dedicated. Part of those funds are dedicated for family engagement, and some of those after school funds are used to support learners in the pre-K space as well too. So there's an opportunity. Someone mentioned the PAC and the BPAC, and those are funds that are leveraged from Title I dollars. So there's different ways in which you can also think about leveraging funds from other pots to help secure resources for fund for things like addressing the transportation needs. Someone else also talked about really thinking about the time piece, recognizing that families work, and it's hard for families to come to activities, but I just encourage folks who are in that space to think about also those multiple ways in which we're tracking your data for family engagement, and that it's not just about activities. And so, maybe there's ways for you to be able to focus on helping to build those relationships. What does that perception data say and look like? And can tell you about ways to kind of start, thinking about strengthening that work, I should say. And then I think Melanie had the idea of, how do we think about partnering with our families? And, oftentimes when we can find ways to co-create an activity with families, that can definitely help to boost participation, because families and that word of mouth, that can be really key to help spread the word in that way. Someone also mentioned, they have activities, and there's a core group of families who always comes to that particular activity. I think it was a BPAC or PAC meeting. Those families are connectors, and so how can we maybe incentivize them or encourage them to help reach out and bring in other families to the school? Or maybe it's not about coming to that learning space. Maybe it's about going doing something out in the field, or maybe it's about launching a program or an opportunity for families to um, earn points to whoever reads the most with their child at home. Just ways in which we can rethink families having to come to a space um, to participate in order to be acknowledged that that family was engaged, etc. So there's just multiple ways that we can think about it. um, Surprisingly, this has never happened before, but we had to make some room in the chat box um, to um, to be able to capture additional contributions, because we were reaching the limit of folks who are participating in the chat. So we really are grateful for all of the dialogue that has occurred, and that dialogue um, is has been archived, so we can definitely um, retrieve that, but I just wanted just to kind of acknowledge that. In the these strategies, as I mentioned before, come from the Illinois State Board of Education framework. You can access that by going to the ISBE website. It's isbe.net. And if you do in the search engine type in IL Family Engagement Framework, it can pop up. You can also go to, and I'll type this in here, I'll type in isbe.net as one link, and then I'll also type in il-fss.net. You can find the framework there as well. And I think that one probably is a more straightforward way to be able to identify the framework. You'll also find resources and tools for teachers and families around family engagement specifically, and a variety of buckets. The framework itself has a nice set of standards that can really help you further unpack some goals and objectives to think about, how you could proceed in moving forward with creating a mission vision that integrates family engagement, integrating families into the continuous improvement planning process, how you make data accessible, etc. So there's a set of standards in that framework that you can use to further unpack some of these general buckets that I just described to you as some of those systemic processes and processes on how to engage families in meaningful ways. I know that some folks on the call are actually site directors, and I know that you do have familiarity with your sites and your schools, etc. But let's just put it out there. How many, and I know we're going to add more to the chat box, I apologize, Karen, but how many, what are some ways in which we've seen, or we have taken a systemic approach to family engagement? I mean, some of that could be as simple as recognizing the fact that you are a home visitor, or that you are a family educator, and you are that dedicated staff person to being able to create that critical relationship with families. So it could be a simple answer just in saying like my role is an acknowledgement of how my school or site or center or district values families. It could be, family engagement as a part of our mission for our learning space. So just if you don't mind, jump into the chat box. What are some of those ways in which you are aware of what you've observed, or what you can identify, or is more of a systemic approach to family engagement? I'm going to see folks type in, so I'll give you some time to contribute. Okay. All right. So Judith, she says she's proposed and created her position of preschool community liaison. Good for you, Judith. And I think, Judith, you bring up a great point that, in our work with families, I say that there's three main buckets that we walk into in our work with families. One is, yes, absolutely being that critical connection, that connector to build that relationship. The resource identifier, if that's the greatest word to use, but part of that role is being able to have as many resources that we can bring into us. But then the other role is to be that advocate, is to really step into spaces that we know are going to be important for families. And so, Judith, you reminded me of that role of the advocate, because like you stepped out and you said you created and proposed a position that was a preschool community liaison, really connecting the preschool space into the community. So that's great. Rachel says it's a part of their mission. Their mission of their center is collaboration between families, community, and children. So that's really great to see that. That's just an inherent part of their mission. Michelle says meeting with parents one-on-one before school starts has been a very meaningful way to start the relationship and partnership with parents and teachers. So at the school, they have a protocol, if you will, around having dedicated time before the school day and space to be able to meet with parents. So that's great. Delonta says that she volunteers as an interpreter in her district when teachers go to home visits for Polish families and other schools in her district. So that's really good. So she actually recognizes that there's a systemic need for translators, and she's literally stepped out into that space in her own time to help fulfill that role. and ensuring that the district has the infrastructure to support non-English speaking families. So that's really powerful. Thank you, Jolanta. Um, Erica says that she's a small district, so they're pretty much all in one. Get it? But this year, she's also working with on the district PAC and combining resources. Great. So they're leveraging resources to be able to optimize ways in which they can really think about extending their family engagement resources and supports. She says our family engagement at the lower level is an asset to extend toward establishing a more. Absolutely, Erica. You brought up a really great point. There's an incredible amount of investments that are put into um, family engagement and in their early ed space. And so, but how critical is that? Is that that investment does not go for naught, especially when families transition into what I call the big building. These are families that have been engaged in meaningful ways, but I think a really an important role in which we all play is when those families transition into the K through 12 space, and how to ensure that there are seamless transitions for when that happens, and that there are allies and the other the feeder schools or districts to ensure that those transitions are successful and those families still have an opportunity to be engaged at the levels that they were in the early ed space. And I know that sounds really ideal, but that does speak to some of the work that we also need to think about doing if we're now already doing or continuing doing and building those partnerships with our what I would call feeder schools and districts for when those families transition from the pre-K space into the school day space. Um, so Jamie says that building partnerships is that's written into the school's philosophy. So it's a value statement that's a part of their school philosophy. And when you have some of those things in writing, you can really use those to help open the door to and remind folks that there is a value for this work. And sometimes that value shift, that perception shift, can be really important in terms of really being able to advocate or think about how different resources can be leveraged to strengthen the work. Cecilia says they meet monthly for family involvement in parents' education, in addition to home visits and all school events. So there's dedicated time for family engagement. So that's a systemic process. That's important. Having a dedicated time, we should really not take that for granted, and also think about ways in which we are optimizing that time and reflective about how we use that time. Louisa says, as a part of her school improvement plan, their school created a parent top program in addition to the parent ad class that already existed. Wonderful. So, we're engaged in reflective practice. So we're looking at where we're at and how can we refine and strengthen or get better and be more responsive to kind of this evolution of how our families move in and out of our spaces. And it doesn't always look this, it shouldn't look the same over the years, because given kind of how the family dynamics change and evolve, we have to be as flexible to be responsive to that. So thank you, Louisa, for sharing. Jill says the program that she's a part of has an open door policy, so parents can drop their children off inside the classroom each morning. That can be helpful for parents to know that they have an opportunity. That, they're not held by time parameters in which they have to drop their children off. There's can also be some really key opportunities to think about how the drop-in policy can be leveraged in other ways too. So that's really great that there's some flexibility there. Lana says sending an email to new parents before school starts, introducing herself. So she starts them before they even start. This is who I am. This is how we can support, or I'd like to think. She says she's always talks about how she's excited to become their child's second. Oh, I like that. She says how she excited to become the child's second teacher, to come along with them to help them learn and grow. So she already says, parents, you're your child's first teacher. We're going to acknowledge that. We're going to recognize that. We're going to help you embrace that idea. So I think that's great. And Beatrice says some of her families have trouble with the potty training at home, and we offer a workshop to help. Personally, I take my own personal time interview with the pediatrician to help my families with the proper information. So yeah, potty training, there's a whole another layer, a level of there, and it really does require a close relationship with that family, and thinking about readiness, right? How is that family prepared? How can we really be knowledgeable about identifying what's right uh, in that family making that decision, and how can we even think about also ensuring that they are going to be successful in how that transition happens. Sue's talking more about the parent university. So the school hosts workshops and seminars to help parents better understand and deal with their kids. Yes, parent universities. I know they've got really great um, um, learning opportunities there. And what I like about, once again, it's a structured event. It's great to hear that there are resources dedicated to host that parent university. And I love, like, in some spaces in which I've seen parent universities, when parents get that, like, acknowledgement that they attended, a university. There's just something to be said about receiving a certificate or saying that they participated or completed those types of learning opportunities that can go a long way, and maybe other goals that they may want to achieve further down the line for themselves. So that's great that there's that dedicated support system there. And then quickly, Peggy says monthly parent meetings to get to know the parents. Monthly parent meetings, that's great, dedicated time. And then Lindsay says we have a TAP program where parents can volunteer in the classroom. We also have parent nights and events. So there's um, there's some things there. There's some ways in which they've structured their program so parents have multiple ways to be able to engage, and that also educators have multiple ways to engage families in dedicated ways there too. All right, so we've talked about practice strategies that we can embed in our own work. We've talked about organizational um, uh, strategies in which we can think about how family engagement is embedded and sustained and integrated into our policies and our infrastructures for our centers and our sites. Now I want us to think about. I'm going to skip that. Our work, and particularly about our next steps. So we have about 17 minutes left on the webinar, and there is a handout that's here. That's called the Professional Goal Plan. You can certainly download it and access it after the webinar, but I wanted to kind of pivot to this document because there were so many things shared during this webinar. I said before, there's a lot of things that we pack in, but I want to make sure that that we really identify maybe our next step as we think about our work and engaging families in meaningful ways. Taking that systemic approach and thinking about our own personal practice strategies, thinking about our barriers, thinking about the priorities in our learning spaces. Um, if you could mentally write down, what would be a key next step for you when you think about your work around family engagement. And I love the fact that we have multiple roles here on the webinar. Some folks are teachers, some folks are home visitors, just a variety of roles here. What would be a great goal for you to work towards around, or next step for you to work towards around your role and your work with families? Let's take a minute to think about that. What are your next steps? Now that we're all here together, and now that you've had some time uh, to think about that, um, if you could take a little bit of time in the chat box to write down what that goal would be, or even just write it down on your own sheet of paper, or type it in your phone, or wherever you have it so you won't lose it. Um, what would be your next step? Now, this professional goal plan that um, a part of the webinar, you can certainly use beyond. I mean, it's a very um, flexible, if you will, document. But what I like about it is that on the second page of it, or the back side of it, there are some specific action steps on it as well that you can identify. And as you know, with any wonderful goal planning document or any goal planning strategy, one of the things that you want to do is you want to be mindful of what your strengths are. And those strengths could include your allies. It could include um, those skills, talents, resources that you know are currently accessible to your fingertips. And then it also asks you to think about where are those growth opportunities and how you'll be able to navigate those stressors or maybe those barriers as you're thinking about that next step or that goal that you want to work towards. Um, and in the action plan, which is a couple lines down below the professional goal plan, in the action plan, uh, you would identify, this is your next step. Now, how are you going to do that? What are those maybe 6 or 7, or maybe just 5 mini steps that you're going to need to do in order to achieve that particular goal? And then you'll identify, of course, a date, but you'll also identify ways in which you're going to celebrate how you've achieved that small step. So I think that's important. How do we celebrate those small wins that inevitably help motivate us to be able to achieve that next step or that goal as we think about our work around family engagement. So I'm going to scroll down so I can see what we've posted here. And I apologize if I'm a little delayed here, but I just found where we left off. Um, Lindsay says that she would like to reach out to some of her parents that she doesn't always get to see every day. My goal would be to send home a positive note each month to every child and parent. Those are two really great goals. One of the things that Lindsay brought out is that, those families that we don't see, those can be some of those hard to reach families, right? And so what do we know about those families and what don't we know and how can we get that information? So I think that's great, Lindsay. Thank you for sharing that. And then she also said she wants to send a positive note home to each month to every child and parent. And that can sound like a lot, but we, you know, um, but sending that positive home can go a long way. And if we work on it one day at a time, we can do it. Diana says that she's going to try and get home visits started. Yes, the teachers do their own, but I'm not a part of that visit. Okay, so Diana's talking about maybe thinking about ways to do her own visits. And Diana, I even encourage you to think about ways in which maybe you can encourage the teachers to find ways that they could share some of that information with you during their home visit. So maybe that's a courageous conversation. But I love this idea and what you're thinking about in terms of really being able to better understand that home context and participate in the home visit work. That's great. Lana says that she feels like communication app would be great benefit. She thought about it a lot, and she just needs to pick the one to do it. Yeah, that would be great, Lana. And another thing to think about is you could test it out with your own family first, just to make sure you know how to use it best, or just maybe a small group of folks within your center. You could one of the things I like to talk about is a professional learning space in which you guys have a safe space to share and experiment and figure things out. So that also could be a great way to explore that learning app that you want to the communication app that you want to utilize. So that's great. Thank you, Lana. And those communication apps can be really great, especially if you're in rural spaces where the distance between folks is far in view is pretty far. And so being able to have an app like that to really uh, uh, provide variety or extend a way to communicate with families could be great. Mari Cruz says she would like to see how home visits are conducted. Okay, great, Mari Cruz. So um, that could be some research that she does within her own learning space. Um, there's also some really great home visiting models that you could um, look at online, or just to familiarize yourself with the home visiting model itself. Once again, I'm going to shout out to the PFCE framework, which you can find in eClicks. And they do have some home visiting methods and strategies there. There's also and I'll type that in, their website, oh, I'm going to mess that up, but I know I have it in the presentation. There's also the parent teacher home visit project. They have a lot of information about the home visit model. So there's a couple resources for you there. Stacia says she does a lot with parent involvement, but she'd like to get parents more involved in the actual classroom. Okay, so Stacia wants to take it to another level. She wants to have parents as partners in the classroom. And so I don't know if folks have done that before, if they could provide support to Stacia around her goal in that way, that would be great. But I know that if we think about parents in the classroom, there are a couple of organizations who actually have a model doing that kind of work. And I'm going to give this to the Logan Square Neighborhood Alliance. In addition to SWAP, they have a really great classroom parent model, Southwest Organizing Project, in which they use and really helping to provide and prepare parents before they go into the classroom, and then also preparing teachers for supporting parents in the classroom. That's been really successful. And so I'm going to give the names of those two organizations to you. Feel free to reach out to them, let them know, that you were on this webinar and you want to learn more about it. And I know for sure that they would be more than happy to share more information with you about that work. So that's great. Beatrice Marie, my goal is to keep open communication with my families and trust relationship with them. I contact them personally and by phone to inform them about activities, only what they need to know they are. So Beatrice is going to continue her work. That's great. Sharonda says she's going to gather how programs are currently engaging. Oh, so Sharonda's going to be doing some data collection around what that work currently looks like, and how, so she can at least get a gauge of what that looks like, and figure out her best next steps. So that's great that she's kind of in that data gathering mode. Jennifer says she's going to get more parents in to volunteer, utilizing an app for more convenient communication, asking parents input for suggestions. Apps can be great. Word of mouth is powerful too. I'm just going to read a couple more, and then we're going to wrap up because I don't want to. I want to make sure we have enough time for the quiz. I mean the raffle. And Peggy says she's going to work on collaboration. Would love to see how managed sites run. So if anyone can reach out to Peggy to support her around, being able to see how managed sites run, that'd be great. And Peggy, feel free to reach out to me as well. I can be more than happy to sit down and talk with you about how that work looks, or at least plug you into some folks who can help support you. I'll provide you my contact information towards the end of the webinar. And Jamie says, oh, she's already got some resources there she's sharing. And Jill would like to use some apps. So thank you all for just really this incredible share that we've been a part of, this webinar. I just want to recap our learning objectives, which was to really summarize the definition for family engagement, which I think we've collectively done. And we've talked about and discussed throughout the webinar. We've had some extensive conversations about the role that we take on as that family liaison, and recognizing that, no matter what hat we wear, family engagement is an integral part of our role. We've been able to discuss and identify some evidence-based strategies and practices for our work around family engagement from a professional perspective in our own personal practice, and then also really thinking about what are those infrastructure pieces needed, processes pieces needed within the organizations that we work within around supporting a systemic approach to family engagement to ensuring that the work is integrated and sustained. And then lastly, we talked about our next steps and how we plan to strengthen our role as a family, service worker, wearing that hat on as family engagement, but ultimately knowing and acknowledging the fact that we are not alone in our work, and that hopefully we've been able to share our contact information and share some ideas on how to extend this work beyond just what we're doing within our spaces. So I want to say a heartfelt thank you. Here are some more resources that I have referenced in this webinar. They're here, and these are so eClicks, the PFCE framework. I also have referenced the NACE's Family Educators and Together's framework. Of course, the National PTA, they have a set of standards that they utilize around family engagement, the ISBE Parent Engagement Framework, and then the U.S. Department of Education's Dual Capacity Framework. All of these you can certainly Google and find more information about those resources. If you would like to have the direct links to those resources or just have any other follow-up questions, feel free to email me at soget2@uic.edu. Thank you all for your phenomenal participation, your feedback, your insight. I'm going to give this over to Karen. If you have any additional questions, feel free to email me and we'll follow up from there. All right, everyone. Take care and have a wonderful, wonderful week.
Thank you, Sarah. Sarah will be back on October 28th presenting Collaborating with Families in Effective Ways. Tomorrow, you will receive an email from me with a recording of this webinar so you can share it with colleagues. The email will also contain an evaluation, and once the evaluation has completed, your certificate will be available to print. Go ahead and give away a couple books. Javier and Jennifer, congratulations. Have a good night, everyone.